Auschwitz began as a place where Polish prisoners were held. The first group arrived on June 14, 1940. At first, it was just barbed wire barracks designed to detain those who opposed German control. Later, orders from the High Command were for expansion. More cells, more fences, and more towers were built. Within a few months, the land began to expand. The camp was set up on the outskirts of Oswiecim, a town in southern Poland. The Nazis chose it because it had serviceable railroad tracks and was isolated. Furthermore, the German government had already evicted the locals, the houses were taken over, and the SS headquarters was set up there. In the first year, the prisoners were mostly Polish civilians. Many were teachers, priests, and trade unionists. There were also communists. All were treated as political prisoners. They slept in wooden bunks, had no blankets, and suffered from cold and hunger. Some died from beatings, others from disease. Most endured as best they could. Meanwhile, the Third Reich's plans were changing. The idea was no longer just repression. Now, they also wanted to exploit the detainees to extract free labor from them. That's why factories were built near the camp. The largest was the Buna plant, controlled by a German chemical company. The SS offered the companies free labor. Thus, the forced labor system emerged. The prisoners worked shifts of more than 12 hours. If someone fell off, they were replaced. There was no respite. Age or health didn't matter. By 1941, Auschwitz was no longer just a prison. It was a camp divided into sections. The first was the original one. The second, known as Birkenau, was built to house more prisoners. And the third, called Monowitz, was where the industries were located. In parallel, the Nazis implemented what they called the final solution. It was a direct order to eliminate all Jews from Europe. The person in charge of that task was Himmler. He relied on Eichmann and other commanders to coordinate everything. Trains began arriving every week. They came from Hungary, France, the Netherlands, Greece, and other occupied countries. When the cars stopped, the prisoners were forced to disembark. At that point, a quick checkup was conducted. SS doctors decided who would go straight to work and who would go to die. Those who were no longer useful were led into sealed chambers. In these chambers, a chemical gas was used. The compound was called Zyklon B. It had been created to kill insects. At Auschwitz, it was applied from above, released through slits. Within minutes, everyone inside was breathless. There was no way out. Afterward, the Sonderkommandos removed the bodies. They were prisoners forced to do this task. They couldn't speak or refuse. If they resisted, they were executed. Their job was to cut the corpse's hair, remove gold teeth, search pockets, and then take them to the furnaces. In a short time, the crematoria were operating day and night. Ashes were thrown into pits or into the river. Shoes, clothes, eyeglasses, everything was classified. Suitcases with names on them were piled up. They were kept as proof of efficiency. Nothing was lost. Auschwitz operated this way for almost 5 years. More than 1 million people passed through its gates. Almost all of them died. Others were forever scarred. Finally, as the Red Army approached, the Germans destroyed part of the facility. They burned papers, blew up cameras, and evacuated the last prisoners. While this was happening, about 80 kilometers northeast of Warsaw, another facility was being prepared with a different purpose. In 1942, a site called Treblinka was built. It was not a camp like the others. From the beginning, it was designed solely for elimination. Treblinka was divided into 2 zones. One served as a quarry, where road materials were extracted. The other was the extermination area. Both were guarded by towers with high wire fences. There were barracks, offices, and warehouses. The trains arriving at Treblinka didn't bring people to work. They came loaded with Jews, Roma, and prisoners from the east. The journey lasted hours. There was no water or space. When they got off, they were taken to a ramp. They were told they were going to be relocated, that they were going to shower first. Lies were part of the process. There were signs, false doors, and unconnected pipes. The prisoners believed it was all real. They left their clothes and belongings behind and went to the gas rooms. These were double-walled barracks. The gas didn't come from chemicals. It came from Soviet engines. SS technicians had adapted tank engines. They started them up and used hoses to blow the smoke into the closed rooms. People died of asphyxiation within minutes. The noise, the heat, and the crying filled everything. When they were finished, the bodies were quickly removed. They had to be cleaned before the next batch. The Sonderkommandos did this work under direct threat. At first, the bodies were buried. Then they began to burn them to erase all traces. Special pits were built with rail grids. At Treblinka, there were no work shifts like at Auschwitz. People didn't live there. They entered in the morning and disappeared within a few hours. Only a few were selected to assist in the process. The rest never left alive. Between July 1942 and October 1943, it is estimated that nearly 950,000 people were murdered. The majority were Polish Jews. Trains left every day from different ghettos: Warsaw, Białystok, Radom, Lublin. The system was so fast that it could process up to 15,000 people in a day. The average was 12,000. Each new group was received as if it were the first. There were always fake smiles, promises of work, and calm-sounding words. Treblinka functioned until the prisoners started an uprising. It was August 1943. They had managed to gather homemade weapons. They started a fire, attacked the guards, and a few hundred escaped into the forest. Many were hunted down afterward, but the revolt marked the end. After that, the SS dismantled what remained. They razed buildings, covered graves, and planted trees. They left a fake farm so no one would suspect. Treblinka disappeared from view for months. Only traces remained in the memories of those who managed to escape. While Auschwitz was a network divided into camps with different functions, Treblinka served only to eliminate. That difference marked the pace of extermination. In Auschwitz, one could live for a few days, weeks, sometimes months. In Treblinka, most died the same day they arrived. The German authorities divided Auschwitz into zones. Camp 1 was administrative and contained the first buildings. Birkenau was the second part, where the largest gas chambers were built. Monowitz was the third, dedicated to industry. The factories used prisoners to produce rubber, metals, and chemicals. In these places, the inmates were worked to the point of total exhaustion. At Birkenau, each new transport was inspected upon disembarkation. An SS doctor raised a hand to the left or right. This gesture decided whether the person would go to work or directly to the gas. Young, strong men passed through. Children, the elderly, and mothers with babies were separated. This selection was systematic. It lasted no more than a few seconds. Nothing was asked. It was just observed. Those who were to be gassed were ordered to remove their clothes. They were told they were going to shower. Then they were led away in a single file. The doors were closed. From above, the gas was thrown. The Zyklon B took 10 to 15 minutes to take full effect. The corpses were piled on top of each other. Some had nail marks on their faces. Many were hugging each other. The Sonderkommandos moved in quickly. They removed rings, earrings, teeth. The bodies of the thinnest and strongest were separated. The chamber had to be emptied before the next group. The bodies were taken to the ovens, and each oven could burn hundreds in a day. The ashes were mixed with earth. They were thrown into the river or used to cover ditches. Mass graves were replaced by mass incineration to erase traces. Medical experiments were also carried out at Auschwitz. Josef Mengele became known for using twins, dwarfs, and pregnant women. He gave them injections, cuts, and extractions. He claimed it was for scientific reasons. Most died after the procedures. Some girls were sterilized, others suffered amputations. In the barracks, the prisoners slept cramped together, up to 7 to a bunk. There were no mattresses, only wood. The latrines were open ditches. There wasn't enough water. Lice and typhus spread easily. Anyone who got sick was eliminated. Each day began with the ringing of a gong. At 4:30 a.m., everyone had to be on their feet. They formed groups of 10. A head count was taken. If someone was missing, everyone waited until they were found, even if they were frostbitten, sick, or had a fever. After the count, they went to work. It could be in factories, cleaning, train unloading, or construction. The shifts lasted between 11 and 12 hours. At the end of the day, they received watery soup and a piece of bread. That piece was supposed to last until the next breakfast. At Treblinka, no such routine existed. There were no bunks, no latrines, no rest areas. Just a single railway track that connected to the ramp. The trains arrived loaded. Between 4,000 and 7,000 people got off at a time. They were asked to leave their valuables behind. Everything was classified: watches, rings, coins. Each item had a number. Everything was filed. The men were taken to the chambers first. The women and children waited outside. They heard the screams. Then they were taken in as well. The gas barracks were disguised with plaques and signs. They had double walls with earth in between to insulate the sound. The gas used was carbon monoxide. It was generated with adapted Soviet engines. Technicians adjusted the flow. The goal was to kill in less than 20 minutes. Once the doors were sealed, no one could leave. There were no vents, no windows, just metal and pressure. Arrival, transportation, selection, and deception. The train was the first step in the extermination process. Windowless, enclosed carriages designed for animals carried up to 80 people per unit. They were forced to stand pressed against each other without food, water, light, air, or access to any type of hygiene. This turned the journey into a punishment that, depending on the starting point, could last for days. When the doors opened, the smell of urine, vomit, and death wafted out first, followed by the unconscious or lifeless bodies, which were unceremoniously pushed aside while the survivors were forced off. At Auschwitz, new arrivals were forced to line up on the platform, surrounded by soldiers armed with dogs and watched from towers, while SS officers shouted orders that no one fully understood, and doctors strategically positioned themselves to begin the immediate selection, dividing the crowd in two directions with a simple gesture of the hand, sending those who appeared strong enough to work to the right and children, the elderly, pregnant women, and the sick to the left, who would be led directly to the gas chambers without knowing it, believing they were going to bathe as part of a disinfection protocol. Treblinka applied a different, faster process without visible selection, since all those who got off the train were considered unnecessary from the outset, and so they were gathered in a fenced area where they were separated only by gender, given instructions by Jewish prisoners forced to act as assistants, dressed in white armbands and forced to speak in calm voices to avoid chaos. These helpers were part of the deception, instructed to maintain order while the Nazis watched from a distance, ensuring that the groups walked obediently toward the wooden barracks that were pretending to be sanitary facilities. Treblinka's chambers were simple structures with double walls reinforced with earth, doors sealed from the outside, and fake showers mounted on the ceiling, where carbon monoxide generated by Soviet engines was piped in until it filled the interior within minutes, causing a swift but agonizing death. When all fell silent, the doors would open and the Sonderkommandos would immediately move in to remove the corpses, piled on top of each other in positions that showed despair, their bodies covered in the marks of struggle, including children clinging to their mothers or people with their eyes open. At Auschwitz, the procedure was similar in purpose but more elaborate, with brick installations that included entrances with signs in German, corridors that simulated changing rooms, and airtight doors that led to rooms with walls covered in white tiles, where Zyklon B, a solid pesticide that turns into a lethal gas when exposed to air, was thrown from openings in the ceiling, filling the room in a matter of minutes and causing asphyxiation due to respiratory collapse. The prisoners, deceived to the end, pressed against each other as the gas closed their lungs, leaving marks on the walls and wounds on their skin from their desperate attempts to escape. The Nazis knew that maintaining order was key to a smooth running system, so everything from the trains to the gas chambers was planned to avoid suspicion. The use of visual signals, false instructions, and neutral language was used, even assigning assistance tasks to other prisoners to generate a sense of routine. Many of those transported got off the train believing they were going to be relocated to work colonies or transferred to other cities. Some even thought they could survive if they followed the rules, so they collaborated with the process without knowing they were walking towards their deaths. At Treblinka, the time between arrival and execution was minimal. The goal was for the entire process to take no more than 2 hours, from the moment the train stopped until the chambers were cleared for the next group. Therefore, a fixed protocol was applied with basic instructions, controlled shouting, and a repeated sequence: get off the car, leave belongings, enter the so-called waiting room, move toward the showers, and disappear. The guards, many of them Ukrainian or Latvian, did not hesitate to use whips or shoot if anyone stopped or asked questions, knowing that their task was to keep the machine running at all costs. At Auschwitz, those deemed fit for work were passed to a second level of the system, where they were stripped of their names and converted into numbers tattooed or written on identification tags that they wore around their necks or sewn onto their uniforms. They were given striped clothing, shoes they rarely wore, and a cap that was sometimes snatched from them by older prisoners. They were then sent to the barracks and assigned to work in factories, workshops, construction sites or cleaning jobs, where they worked shifts exceeding 12 hours, with minimal food rations without rest and under constant threat, knowing that any illness or accident would return them to the left-hand row. At Treblinka, only a small number of prisoners were separated from the main group to perform internal tasks such as cleaning the carriages, sorting clothing, sorting valuables, extracting gold teeth, and transporting bodies. These duties were mandatory under penalty of death and did not guarantee survival, since they could be executed at any moment and replaced by new arrivals. These forced laborers lived isolated from the rest, without contact with the outside world, knowing that their days were numbered, but they still obeyed because the alternative was a shot in the back of the head. The arrival system at both camps left no room for individual decisions or explanations. Everything was swift, cold, and methodical, designed to move thousands of people per day without causing chaos, repeating the same pattern over and over again with almost industrial precision, where each step served a specific purpose and any deviation was punished with immediate violence. Reasons were not given at Auschwitz or Treblinka. All the prisoners heard were brief orders, shouts in languages many didn't understand, and prolonged silences that ended with doors closed, engines running, or chambers sealed. Transport to Auschwitz began long before the train, with orders issued by local authorities requiring Jews to present themselves with a limited list of belongings. They were required to leave their homes, close their businesses, and voluntarily surrender at assembly points. From there, they were taken to secondary stations and, without further warning, loaded onto freight cars in huge groups, always under the guard of armed soldiers. Family members said goodbye in the hope of seeing each other again, unaware that the place they were going was not openable and that the names written on the transport lists would be the last they would carry as identification. The cars, padlocked from the outside, were not opened at any point along the journey, and the only sounds were the squeal of brakes, the sound of banging against the wood, and the wailing of those who could not bear the confinement. No stops were allowed for medical attention or to remove corpses or to provide food or water, and upon reaching the Birkenau platform, the prisoners disembarked in silence, exhausted, stunned, unaware that in a matter of minutes they would be divided by an unknown officer who, with a simple movement of his arm, would decide who would live a few more weeks and who would die that same day without anyone knowing their fate. At Treblinka, the process was even more brutal in its speed, as there wasn't even a semblance of registration or selection, and everyone who stepped off was treated as temporary transit, marched without pause toward the wooden corridors disguised as sanitary facilities, where they were guided by other prisoners under threat of death who feigned normalcy as they herded the crowds toward a place of no return. No photographs were taken, no names were written, no uniforms were issued. They were only asked to leave their things in order, to remember their coat rack number, and not to ask questions, as it was all supposedly part of a routine procedure before being taken to work. The gas rooms functioned as the last step in a chain that began with forged documents, continued with train tickets stamped by puppet governments, and ended in an airtight room where the oxygen was replaced with carbon monoxide or Zyklon B gas, depending on the camp, while outside the engines kept running, the lines kept moving, and the process continued uninterrupted. Those waiting outside had no idea what was happening inside, although some sensed that something was wrong, especially when they heard screams, bangs, or saw smoke and ash rising from nearby chimneys. Auschwitz had a permanent infrastructure, with brick buildings, towers, electrical grids, and well-defined paths. So its appearance could deceive those who arrived, since from the train it looked like an industrial complex, even with signs that spoke of work, discipline, and cleanliness, while Treblinka was a temporary construction made of wood, wires, and light barracks installed in a forest clearing far from the towns, without unnecessary signs and with a design thought to be dismantled without leaving a trace. This visual difference did not change the function, since in both cases the goal was to eliminate people en masse without the possibility of appeal or registration. The separation between men and women occurred almost immediately in both camps, generally after getting off the car, since officials knew that keeping families together could generate resistance or delays, and so a strict division was established, sending women with children to one side and men to the other, creating the illusion that they would later be reunited when in reality both groups took different paths to death or forced labor, depending on the camp. This forced separation caused confusion, tears, but also obedience, as many believed they had to follow instructions to avoid punishment or permanent separation. At Auschwitz, those selected underwent a second inspection, where they were stripped naked, examined by doctors, and then disinfected with irritating liquids that burned their skin. After this, they were given old, cut-off or unsized clothes and tattooed with a number that identified them from that moment on. Their names, stories, professions, or relationships were discarded as unnecessary. They were then sent to barracks with hundreds of other prisoners, where they received instructions from older survivors on how to behave, how to line up, when to speak, and what to do to avoid attracting the attention of the kapos or guards. Treblinka lacked such steps, as those selected to work the camp's tasks were not given special clothing or a number, only a band on their arm marking them as useful for a limited time. This did not guarantee their safety, since they could be replaced at any time by other newly arrived prisoners, without explanation or warning, and their final destination was the same as the rest: the pit, the oven, or the open field where ashes or human remains were dumped. There was no routine, no room to adapt, just a constant chain of death that was repeated every day with different people. The role of the Sonderkommandos was similar in both camps. They were prisoners forced to handle the bodies, remove valuables, clean the chambers, keep the crematoria running, and remain silent, knowing that their work kept them alive for a few days, but that their knowledge posed a risk to the Nazis, so they were periodically executed and replaced by others. Many of them left hidden messages, buried writings, or tried to memorize details to recount if they managed to escape, although most did not live long enough to do so. The scale of transport grew over time, and by 1943 thousands of people were being moved every day from dozens of European cities, with trains departing from regular stations and escorted by local police, military personnel, and civil servants who carried out orders without question, issuing papers, completing forms, and ensuring that the cars were full. While at the final destination, the ovens, chambers, and trenches were already being prepared to receive the next batch. The entire continent was connected by that web of death, where every link operated uninterruptedly and where silence was part of the system. Deception as a tactic was not only applied on the platform, it also occurred before boarding the train, as in many cases food, work, or family reunification were promised as incentives to surrender. Fake leaflets, clean uniforms, or decorated carriages were even shown to the future prisoners, who upon reaching their destination were faced with a reality they could not change, where every step was watched, every gesture interpreted as rebellion, and every attempt to question was answered with shouts, blows, or gunshots, which ultimately broke any attempt at resistance. Both camps used systematic methods to avoid mass panic, avoiding shooting on the platform except in extreme cases and maintaining a semblance of order that served to deceive new arrivals, who walked along marked corridors, followed painted arrows, and left their belongings behind in the hope of retrieving them later, unaware that their clothes would be sorted, their valuables stored, their hair cut, and their bodies incinerated or buried within hours, while other groups arrived behind them, repeating the same route as if it were the first time. Work or death, daily life in the camps. At Auschwitz, the day began before dawn. At 4:30 a.m., a metal bar struck the center post and everyone had to get up immediately. The barracks were dark, long, and cold, with wooden bunks without mattresses or blankets, and up to 5 people were crammed into each bed. Many woke up sick, sweating, or feverish, but they still had to go out into the yard with the others. The guards shouted from the entrance and kicked the doors to speed up the formation. The prisoners filed out and were arranged in groups of 10, while the officers called the roll several times. If the number didn't add up, the count was repeated regardless of the weather. In snow or rain, the men and women stood at attention for hours, freezing and in wet clothes. Some fell to the ground from weakness, and if they didn't get up, they were dragged by their feet and left to one side. The rest had to remain standing, silent and facing forward. No one was allowed to speak, move, or bend down, and if they did, they received a blow from the butt of a rifle or the kapos's stick. After the head count, a hot liquid was distributed in a rusty can. They called it tea, but it tasted like dirty water and provided no warmth or strength. This was the only meal of the day until nightfall, and many drank it quickly so as not to faint during the work. The work groups left the camp gates in columns. Some were taken to factories like Monowitz, others to construction sites inside Auschwitz or to unload wagons. They were always escorted by armed soldiers and loudly barking dogs. Those who walked slowly were pushed with rifle butts or pulled out of line without explanation. In the factories, shifts lasted more than 12 hours. The noise of the machines made it impossible to speak. The tools were heavy, and the air was full of dust. Those who cut themselves were bandaged with old rags and forced to continue. Those who couldn't continue were replaced and, in many cases, eliminated that same night. Inside the camp, the work was just as hard. Trenches were dug, walls were built, wheelbarrows full of stones were pushed, and bathrooms were cleaned with wet rags. Everything had to be done quickly and without mistakes. A misplaced brick, a dropped shovel, or an odd gesture was cause for immediate punishment. Upon returning to the camp, it was another line, another count, and another wait. The guards checked everyone, and if one was missing, the meal was cancelled until they appeared or someone reported them. The punishment for covering for an escapee was confinement in airless cells or public hanging in front of everyone. The evening meal was a piece of black bread and a spoonful of something thick, sometimes with potato peelings or pieces of turnip. Some saved it for the next day, but most devoured it in seconds. They ate standing up or sitting on the floor. There were no plates or cutlery. Anything dropped was never recovered. After eating, the barracks were locked from the outside. The air was thick with the gases from the sick bodies. There were lice, bedbugs, mice, dried vomit, and people coughing all night. The noise was constant. Even so, everyone tried to get some sleep so they wouldn't collapse in line the next morning. At Treblinka, the routine was different. Almost all the deportees died on the same day, so there were no headcounts, shifts, or long days. Only a few were selected to work for a few weeks inside the camp. These men lived on the edge of the gas chambers, sleeping in low, dark barracks, eating scraps, and watching the trains arrive non-stop. They were forced to remove the bodies, wash the floor, scrape the walls, clean up the blood, and stack the dead like wood. They had to do it in silence. If they spoke to each other, if they were delayed, or if they made a mistake, the guards executed them without warning. The place where they worked was cramped, hot, and smoky. The engines that generated the gas ran non-stop. At the end of each cycle, the doors opened and they entered to push the bodies, take belongings from pockets, extract gold teeth, and carry the corpses to the graves. Clothes were stacked by size and color. Shoes were sorted. Money and jewelry went directly into the trunks. Everything was recycled. Nothing was wasted. Every dead prisoner left something behind, which was picked up by the momentary survivors. Everything had to be done quickly and quietly. The workers were watched by Ukrainian and German soldiers who fired at the slightest mistake. They knew they would only last a few weeks, so they obeyed out of fear. Every time a new train arrived, some were replaced by fresher ones. No one knew when their turn would be. The prisoners assigned to the crematoria at Treblinka worked with smoke in their faces. When the chambers could no longer cope, the bodies were burned in open-air pits. Grates were erected from rails, wood, and stones. On top of them, the corpses were placed one after the other. To speed up the burning, human fat, obtained from the first decomposing bodies, was poured. The smell spread throughout the camp. The nearby trees turned black, the earth turned to ash. The workers were given shovels to move the bones, hooks to turn the bodies, and rags to cover their faces. The days were endless. They worked from the first train to the last. When there was no transport, the barracks were cleaned, the doors were repaired, new graves were dug. The leaders called the roll. If someone didn't respond, they were shot. If someone showed fear, they received a blow. If someone fell, they never got up again. The food was stale bread, dirty water, and the cold remains of what was left over. No one could get sick. No one could sit down. No one could ask questions. Every step was taken with their eyes on the ground. At Auschwitz, punishments were part of everyday life. They were designed to break bodies and silence voices. The bosses, who were powerful prisoners, beat without hesitation. They used sticks, belts, or fists. Sometimes they hung the punished by their arms for hours. Other times they forced them to kneel on sharp stones. If someone was caught speaking Polish or Yiddish, if they stole an onion, if they helped a friend, if they cried out loud, they were punished in front of others. Women suffered similar punishments. They also worked in factories, laundries, kitchens, and fields. Some were forced to clean floors with wet rags, others to carry buckets of excrement. If a woman menstruated, she had to hide it. If a guard noticed, she was beaten or sent to the punishment block. There, in windowless cells, they remained for days without food. Sometimes they were taken out for interrogation, sometimes they never returned. Children were used for light but equally humiliating labor. Some collected garbage, others cleaned the guards' shoes. A few were sent for experiments. The brothers were separated. The youngest were beaten so they would learn to line up. Anyone who cried was locked up. Anyone who begged for food was locked up. The smallest bodies were used to test gas or injections. When they were no longer useful, they disappeared. On Sundays at Auschwitz, there was no rest. Inspections were organized, the barracks were searched, the courtyards were cleaned. Sometimes public executions took place. The group was silently assembled. The accused prisoner was brought in. A rope was placed around his neck. The others were asked to watch. Then he was hanged and left hanging for several hours. No one spoke. No one moved. Afterward, everyone returned to work. At Treblinka, the executions were more discreet. The workers knew they were short-lived. Every 2 weeks, the officials selected new groups. The older ones were taken to the forest. They were told they would be changing sections. Upon arrival, they were tied up and executed. Their bodies were burned with the others. There was no trace left. Only the new ones knew they had replaced someone. Auschwitz had different blocks. Some were for punishment, others for doctors, others for holding. Block 10 was used for experiments. There, drugs were tested, substances were injected, sterilizations were performed, skin cuts were made, notes were taken. Some survived, others died. The doctors wore white uniforms. They had assistants. They didn't speak to the prisoners. They just used them. If one screamed, they put them to sleep. If they moved, they tied them up. In the holding block, those selected to die remained until there was room in the chambers. They slept on the floor. They didn't eat. They didn't know if they would die tomorrow or in an hour. They listened to the trains. They heard the footsteps. They waited in silence. Sometimes they sang softly. Sometimes they prayed. Then they were called by number. They filed out. No one returned. Work didn't save anyone. It only postponed the end. There were prisoners who had been at Auschwitz for years. Some were cooks, others clerks, others in charge of clothing. Those had access to more food or shelter. But they were also watched. If they did favors, if they hid someone, if they spoke to the new ones, they were executed anyway. Privileges were short-lived. At Treblinka, there were no old prisoners. The cycle was short. New workers learned quickly. They were taught to push, carry, and keep quiet. Within a few days, they knew how to clean up blood, how to stack corpses, how to pretend they felt nothing. Soon they were replaced. Some tried to escape. Few succeeded. Most were caught and hanged at the entrance. They were left hanging as a warning. No one could look, but everyone looked. The differences between the camps were of form, not substance. At Auschwitz, work was part of the system. At Treblinka, death was the only goal. Both were machines. Both operated on orders, fear, and bodies. Everything was done in series. No one asked why. No one had the right to stop. The days were the same. There was no calendar. There was no rest. There was no hope. Only shouting voices, marching footsteps, falling bodies. That's what life in the fields was like. Extermination methods, gas, bullets, and fire. At Auschwitz, death was carried out in a chain reaction. The gas chambers were large rooms, sealed with metal doors and cement walls. From the outside, they looked like bathrooms. At the entrance, a sign for showers was posted. The prisoners were led there in a single file, with the instruction that it was a hygienic procedure. They were asked to leave their clothes on numbered hooks to remember the location so they could retrieve them later. Some believed this was true, others sensed it, but they obeyed nonetheless. Upon entering, the place was clean. There were pipes in the ceiling. They looked like ordinary plumbing. The door closed with a loud bang. From above, a soldier threw Zyklon B crystals through an opening. The gas began to expand. First came the coughing, then the screaming, then the shoving. Within minutes, the air became unbreathable. Bodies were crammed into the pit. The shortest were crushed. The tallest scratched the wall. Silence followed. When nothing could be heard, the place was aired out. The Sonderkommandos entered quickly. They removed the corpses, checked their mouths, cut their hair. Everything of value was removed. Then the bodies were taken to the crematorium. The task had to be completed in less than an hour. If they delayed, the shouts of the foreman quickened the pace. If someone lingered, they were replaced. At Treblinka, the system was more crude. The chambers were made of concrete and wood. They didn't use Zyklon B, they ran on carbon monoxide. The gas was generated by Soviet tank engines modified to inject smoke directly into the chambers. The prisoners entered naked, guided by other prisoners wearing white armbands. They were told it was a shower, just like at Auschwitz. The gas entered through thick pipes. It took several minutes to fill the chamber. Sometimes the engine failed. In those cases, the bodies died of slow asphyxiation. The space was small. People were pressed against the door. Some fainted beforehand. Others died standing up. The stains on the woodwork proved this. Nail marks on the walls were visible. Then the doors were opened and the Sonderkommandos quickly entered. They removed the bodies and took them to the cremation camp. There were no ovens. Open pits were used, over which grills made of rails were placed. The bodies were stacked in layers. Between each row, wood or fat was placed. The fire burned for days. The smoke could be seen for miles. The bones were pounded with sledgehammers. The ashes were sifted. What remained was thrown into rivers or buried. Everything was done by prisoners. No one could speak. No one could cry. If anyone faltered, they were shot. Replacements arrived on the next train. At Auschwitz, the crematoria were permanent structures. Each building had chambers, disinfection rooms, and ovens. There were several in operation. The pace was constant. On days with heavy traffic, work continued without pause. If the ovens couldn't handle the fire, open-air pits were used. The bodies were burned next to the barracks. The flames reached the sky. The prisoners knew what was happening, but they didn't speak. Men selected for their strength worked in the crematoriums. They had to push carts, feed the ovens, and collect bones. They did it without gloves, without masks, without protection. The heat was unbearable. Smoke entered their noses. Their clothes became soaked with sweat. No one could rest. Shifts were 12 hours or more. When they were done, the workers were locked in. They couldn't report what they saw. German technicians inspected everything. They controlled the number of bodies per hour. They adjusted the valves. They measured the combustion time. Each oven had its limit. If one broke, it was repaired within a few hours. The system had to continue. The goal was to leave no one alive. At Treblinka, the method wasn't as efficient, so in 1943, the Germans decided to improve the structures. The chambers were enlarged, the walls were reinforced, the gas flow was increased, but they never managed to match the pace of Auschwitz. Still, the result was the same. Thousands died every week. The camp didn't stop. Bodies that couldn't be cremated were buried. Mass graves were dug. Corpses were dumped in rows. When they filled, they were covered with earth and lime. Dogs would dig. Sometimes rain would leave bones exposed. The prisoners had to re-dig the trench and cover the remains. It was a daily task. Auschwitz also used mass graves in the early months. Before crematoriums were built, bodies were buried near the river. Then the graves were dug to burn the old remains. The goal was to erase all traces. Everything had to be gone. No skeletons could remain. No names could remain. Only ashes. Experiments also killed. Some prisoners were used to test vaccines, chemicals, and radiation. Others were injected with unexplained substances. Cuts were made, extractions were made, and transfusions were given. Some died on the stretcher. Others were paralyzed. The body was sent to the crematorium as if it were just another one. Individual executions were common. A shot in the back of the head, a hanging, a phenol injection. No trial was necessary. An order was enough. A suspicion was enough. Punishment was instantaneous. The body was dragged away. No one claimed it. At Treblinka, no time was wasted on details. Everything was done quickly. Arrival, death, cleaning, the gas, the fire, the pit. The system had no pauses. If one chamber failed, two were used. If the motor didn't start, the prisoners were pushed to another room. The goal was not to stop the chain. At Treblinka, the gas motors were checked daily. Technicians turned on the generators before the trains arrived. The chambers were swept and aired. The walls were cleaned with water and lime. Everything had to look in order. The prisoners charged with preparing the place did so quickly. If they didn't finish on time, they were executed. If they made a mistake, they were executed too. There was no room for error. The Ukrainian soldiers received precise instructions. They guarded the doors, they shouted orders, they beat those who hesitated. Their role was to maintain the uninterrupted flow. If a line slowed down, they intervened with bayonets. If someone tried to flee, they shot. No one left the chamber once inside. The doors were secured from the outside with crossbars. The running engines began to smoke. Gas filled the air within minutes. Surviving witnesses said that at Treblinka, the doors could be heard banging from inside. Some said the screams lasted several minutes. Others claimed silence came in less than 5. The number of people per chamber varied. Sometimes 150 entered, sometimes more. They pushed each other until they were pressed up against the wall. No one knew how many would die at once. They only knew that no one left. At Auschwitz, the system was improved over time. At first, the chambers were small and the crematoriums rudimentary. Later, large facilities were built, with chambers capable of killing thousands in a single day. The ovens worked day and night. The heat was constant. Smoke filled the sky. Engineers measured the hourly capacity. The bodies were moved on carts. They were sorted by size. The thinnest were placed on top, the largest below. Bones and fat were used to keep the fire going. The crematorium plans included details on ventilation, airtight doors, chimneys, and gas distribution. Everything was designed for efficiency, not to cause pain or prevent it, only to eliminate many people in a short time. The walls were reinforced to resist pushing. The windows were sealed. The ceilings were covered with cement boards. Internal lighting was suppressed. Only the operators saw the interior, and only after the process. The procedure was always the same. The prisoners arrived. They were ordered to undress. They were spoken to calmly. They were asked to leave their shoes together, their clothes in a pile, and their jewelry in a box. Then they were led inside. The door was closed. Gas fell from an opening in the ceiling. The bodies reacted immediately. They pressed together. They twisted. Some vomited. Others defecated. All of this was part of the Sonderkommando's work. These men were replaced from time to time. They knew they were witnesses. They knew they wouldn't live long. Still, they did their job. They dragged bodies. They cut hair. They extracted teeth. They lit the ovens. They cleaned the blood. When it was their turn to die, they did so in silence. Newcomers took their places. They learned what to do in a few hours. At Treblinka, ovens weren't needed. The fires were open. Old rails, dry branches, and human fat were used. The bodies were laid out in layers. The fires burned for days. The ashes were scattered with shovels. What didn't burn was crushed. Some remains were kept for evidence. Most were thrown into deep pits. Sometimes they were mixed with lime, sometimes with earth. The rain stirred everything. They had to be covered again. The prisoners in charge of the cremations didn't speak. They couldn't cry. They couldn't stop. If they did, they were shot in the back of the head. The guards watched them from towers. They carried binoculars. They used whistles. If someone moved slowly, they were pulled out. If they bent down without permission, they were dragged. The pace had to be maintained. The smoke couldn't stop. At Auschwitz, medical experiments caused thousands of deaths. Some prisoners were selected for their physique, others for their age. They were taken to Block 10. There, they were exposed to unknown substances. They were injected with gasoline, air, serum, bacteria. The results were recorded. Their reactions were observed. When they were no longer useful, they were sent to the crematorium. Their bodies were treated like any other. In the punishment block, executions took place daily. Those accused of treason were hanged. Those who tried to escape were shot. Those who broke the rules were locked up without food or water. The cells were cramped. The air was thin. Some died standing up, others sitting down. No one lasted long. The bodies were dragged away at night. No one asked about them. At Treblinka, mass executions were carried out without a list. The trains arrived loaded, the cameras killed in batches. When the number dropped, another convoy was sent. The camp never stopped. The officials had tables. They knew how many per day, how many per hour, how many per week. If the rate slowed, there were shouts. If it increased, there was celebration. Everything was measured. Everything was counted. Auschwitz documented more. Records, photos, names, numbers were kept. Treblinka burned everything. No archives remained, only ashes. That was the difference. But the goal was the same. Kill quickly, kill silently, kill without a trace. In both camps, extermination was a task. Not an act of fury, not an accident. It was an order, repeated, executed, perfected. Every piece fit together. Every step was thought out. The chambers, the ovens, the engines, the prisoners, the guards, the trains. Everything was in the service of death. That's how the system worked. Resistance, rebellions, and final traces. At Treblinka, the idea of rebelling began among the prisoners who worked in the vaults and crematoria. They knew their fate was sealed, that sooner or later they would be executed and replaced. Some had seen those who came before them die. They knew the cycle was short, lasting no more than a few weeks, so they spoke to each other in low voices, in secluded corners, always careful not to be seen by the guards. They wanted to escape, or at least destroy the place before they died. The plan was simple: obtain weapons, make tools, copy keys, coordinate the internal teams without being noticed. They couldn't use papers or maps. Everything had to be memorized. They were organized into groups. One would be in charge of the keys, another of the weapons, another of cutting the electricity. They had to act quickly. If they failed, everyone would die. If they delayed, the relief forces would arrive and ruin everything. On August 2nd, 1943, the workers lit the spark. They took advantage of the shift change. They accessed the arsenal. They took out small arms. Some had improvised knives, others only stones. They mingled with the rest and attacked silently. They killed the first guards without making a sound. But one managed to escape and raised the alarm. The siren sounded. The shots began. Chaos was total. Some prisoners fled into the woods. Others died near the wire fence. A few managed to break through the fence. Almost all were killed by machine gun fire, but at least 70 managed to escape. Of those, less than half survived until the end of the war. Still, the Treblinka rebellion was a warning sign. The camp never operated normally again. In the following months, the Germans began to destroy it. They dismantled the chambers. They burned documents. They demolished barracks. They covered the graves with earth and plants. They built a fake farm on the grounds. They wanted to erase all traces. They wanted no one to know what happened there. But those who escaped told their stories. With names, dates, and details, they told how Treblinka worked, who ran it, how many died. At Auschwitz, there was also resistance. It wasn't as open as at Treblinka, but it was constant. Some prisoners hid messages. Others secretly took photos. Workers sabotaged machines in the factories. Furnaces broke down for no reason. Valves jammed. Doors didn't close properly. It was all part of an effort to slow death. In October 1944, a rebellion broke out in crematorium number 4. The Sonderkommandos knew they would be executed soon. They had seen what happened to the previous ones, so they organized in secret. They made explosives with stolen gunpowder. They hid the charges in cans. They waited for the right moment. That day, they attacked the guards. They lit fires in the corridors. The crematorium burned within minutes. There were gunshots, screams, smoke. Some tried to escape. Very few succeeded. Most were captured and shot, but the oven was destroyed. It could never be used again. It was the only time one of the Auschwitz crematoria was completely rendered useless by the prisoners themselves. Those who participated knew they wouldn't live. They did it anyway. They wanted to leave a mark. They wanted to interrupt the cycle, even if only for a few hours. These actions didn't change the system, but they showed that even in the worst places, there were those who fought, in hiding, in fear, without hope, but they fought. Resistance also came from outside. Some civilians helped hide fugitives. Others delivered food near the tracks. There were networks that passed messages. Some trains were flagged. Some stations announced what they were transporting. Sometimes a note arrived in time. Sometimes someone found out before it was too late. At Treblinka, the Nazis didn't allow witnesses. That's why they eliminated almost all the internal workers. But they failed with some. Those who escaped told everything. Their names were recorded. They testified in trials. They spoke in front of cameras. Their words were used as evidence. At Auschwitz, the Soviets arrived in January 1945. The Germans had already evacuated. They took the strongest prisoners on forced marches. They left behind the weakest, the sick, those who couldn't walk. Those were liberated. The soldiers who entered found empty barracks, extinguished ovens, burnt papers, but they also found bodies, clothes, shoes, bones. They found the walls, the bars, the cameras. The Soviets took photos. They called in doctors. They noted every detail. Then they brought in journalists. The world saw what remained. The images circulated. Names began to appear. Faces, ages, nationalities. Everything began to take shape. What had been secret became public. In the days after the liberation of Auschwitz, the Soviets documented everything they found. They made lists of personal belongings. They sorted suitcases, shoes, clothing, brushes, photographs. Every single thing was a sign of someone who had been there. Doctors examined the survivors. They noted their names, ages, weights, illnesses. Many were unable to speak. Others died days later. Hunger, cold, and wounds didn't heal overnight. Journalists who arrived at the camp reported on it in their newspapers. The images traveled around the world. Rusted rails, empty buildings, charred ovens. Everything was there, frozen. On the tables, the medical instruments, on the walls, the nail marks, on the ceilings, the gas grates. There was no doubt about what had happened. All that remained was to gather the facts. Find those responsible. Understand how it operated for so long. There was no liberation at Treblinka. The camp had been dismantled months before. The Germans burned documents, destroyed cameras, scattered the rubble. They planted trees, put up fences, brought in livestock. They made everything look like a farm. When the Soviets arrived, they found grass, animals, farming tools. Only by digging did they notice the difference. The soil was soft. Roots didn't grow. A few centimeters below, remains appeared. Bone fragments, pieces of cloth, buttons, children's shoes. The archaeologists and forensic scientists did their work. They marked the graves. They used rods to determine the depth. They took photos. They saved samples. They compared them with the testimonies. Everything matched. The place was real. The accounts were true. The massacre had occurred. Not a single chamber remained standing. But the ground spoke. Every meter held a story. The trials began soon after. In Nuremberg, several officers were interrogated. Some denied everything. Others admitted only in parts. Few acknowledged their role at Auschwitz. Even fewer spoke about Treblinka. Most said they were only following orders, that they didn't know, that it wasn't their responsibility. But the documents appeared. The photos, the letters, the train logs, the papers with numbers, dates, signatures. The victims were called to testify. They spoke calmly. They recalled step by step how they arrived, what they saw, who they lost, what they were ordered to do, how each one was saved. Their words served to establish history, to trace the roots, to establish the methods, the numbers, the hierarchies, those responsible. In Israel, Germany, Poland, and France, more trials took place. Some guards were identified decades later. They were found in other countries with other names. They were brought before courts. They were confronted by survivors. Some were over 80 years old. They walked slowly. They didn't speak much, but the memories were strong. The victims recognized them by gestures, words, scars. The archives confirmed this. Memorials were erected at both sites. At Auschwitz, the barracks, the ovens, the barbed wire fences were preserved. A museum was built. Objects, uniforms, and documents were exhibited. Hundreds of thousands of people visit it every year. They walk the tracks, they enter the buildings, they see the cameras, the shoes, the suitcases. They listen to the recordings. They see the names. It's proof of what happened. At Treblinka, the memorial is different. There are no structures, only stones, hundreds of stones marked with city names. They represent those who arrived. The ground continues to speak. Remains are still found, bone fragments after the rains. The earth moves. The stories continue to emerge. Each visitor walks in silence. There are no guides, no audio, only the empty space, only the stones. The survivors of both camps recounted what they experienced. Some wrote books, others spoke in schools, in interviews, in courts. They remembered the faces, the smells, the phrases. They spoke of the trains, the selections, the bosses, the cameras. They mentioned the names, they pointed out the leaders. They described the methods, all without embellishment, all with accuracy. Many died without seeing justice. Others managed to testify. To look into the eyes of those who imprisoned them, beat them, forced them to drag corpses. They did it without shouting, just by telling what happened. With each account, the map was put together. The machine was reconstructed. It was understood how it worked, what parts it used, whose hands moved it. The documents found showed that everything was recorded. Every train had a list, every group had a number, every chamber had a count. The ovens kept hourly counts, the engines had logbooks, the barracks had records, nothing was improvised, everything was programmed, everything was executed with precision. Today, both camps are references. Auschwitz as a symbol of massive, systematic, sustained horror. Treblinka as proof of swift, direct, traceless extermination, one with crematoriums, another with mass graves, one with archives, another with disturbed earth, but both with the same objective, to eliminate bodies, to erase names, to silence lives. The traces did not disappear, they remain on the skin of those who lived, on the walls that remained, in the photos, in the phrases carved in stone, in the ashes mixed with the earth, in the lists that were not burned, in the ownerless watches, in the footless shoes, in the handless brushes. That's how the camps ended. That's how the witnesses spoke. That's how history was pieced together.